The cold sky above Europe in 1943 was not blue, it was gray, layered with smoke and frozen wind, stitched together by the contrails of aircraft that carried both hope and death. Every morning as the first light broke over the airfields of England, hundreds of American bombers, B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, rose into the pale light like swarming metal beehives. Their wings glistened with frost, their engines roared with a mechanical fury that vibrated through the bones of the young men inside them. They were barely out of their teenage years, yet they were entrusted with the survival of entire cities. Each man had a job: pilot, navigator, bombardier, radio operator, flight engineer, and, most perilously, gunner. The gunners, perched in glass bubbles and tail cones, were the last line of defense against the storm of German fighters that seemed to materialize from the clouds themselves. These were the days before radar-guided weapons, before heat-seeking missiles or automatic targeting. A gunner's success depended entirely on his eyes, his instinct, and his trigger finger. And yet, despite their courage, their early missions were disastrous. The first waves of bomber missions deep into Germany were slaughterhouses in the sky. The Luftwaffe's Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s sliced through bomber formations like hawks tearing into flocks of geese. The gunners fired back with everything they had, 50 caliber rounds that could tear through metal and bone alike. But too often, their bursts missed. Bullets sprayed into empty sky. Gunners swore they had the enemy dead in their sights, but their tracers curved harmlessly past the German planes. No one could understand why. For the U.S. Army Air Forces, the doctrine was clear: tight formations, overlapping fields of fire, precision bombing. The Norden bomb sight was supposed to deliver near-miraculous accuracy. But what good was accuracy when the bombers rarely made it home? In October 1943, on missions like Schweinfurt and Regensburg, entire bomber groups were mauled. Out of 291 bombers sent, 60 never returned. The survivors limped back with engines burning, fuselages shredded, and blood freezing on the inside of their glass turrets. The high command believed the issue was training. Maybe the gunners weren't experienced enough. Maybe their aim was off. Maybe the Germans had found a new tactic. But the truth was far stranger, and it would take one man, an unlikely mix of scientist and soldier, to uncover it. His name was Frederick O. Boots Bless, a future ace pilot and instructor, but before his own fame in Korea, he studied something that few had considered in World War II: the invisible mathematics of lead. You see, in aerial combat, hitting a moving target isn't about aiming at the plane, it's about aiming ahead of it, where the target will be by the time the bullet arrives. Every fighter pilot knew this, but bomber gunners, operating under completely different speeds and attack angles, had to relearn the rules of space and time. The problem wasn't the men, it was physics. When a German plane attacked head-on, a terrifying, suicidal tactic, they closed at speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour. The gunner had less than 3 seconds to aim, fire, and pray. The tracer rounds he saw weren't perfectly accurate indicators. They lagged behind the real bullets. What the gunners saw wasn't where their bullets were, but where they had been. In other words, they were shooting too far ahead of the target. So the Army Air Forces began testing. In training fields across the U.S., they set up moving target ranges, mounting machine guns on pivoting rigs that could simulate real combat angles. Observers noticed something strange. When new gunners fired slightly behind the target, they hit it more often. It made no sense until ballistic experts from right field ran the numbers. They discovered that due to the relative speed of the bomber, the angle of approach of the enemy, and the parallax distortion of the gunner's sight, the apparent center of the target was always offset. To hit the real target, you had to aim behind what you saw. This discovery would quietly rewrite the tactics of aerial defense. But in the skies over Germany, no one cared about theory. Gunners learned the hard way, through fire and death. The men of the 8th Air Force became living laboratories. They painted enemy silhouettes on hangar walls, practiced deflection shooting with clay pigeons, and memorized the angles of attack like catechisms. If he's coming from 1 o'clock high, aim under the wing. If he's diving from 6 o'clock, lead behind the tail. Soon, veteran gunners began whispering their own rules of thumb. One of them, Sergeant Don Nichols, would later recall, "They told us to aim where the kraut is, but the ones who lived long enough learned to aim where he was a split second ago." The shift seemed insane. In the chaos of aerial combat with smoke and flak and screams all around, to deliberately aim away from the target defied instinct. But slowly, results spoke louder than fear. Miss rates began to drop. Kill ratios began to climb. The skies started to tilt in America's favor. The 8th Air Force's gunnery schools became crucibles of innovation. At Kingman, Arizona, Las Vegas, Nevada, and Tyndall Field, Florida, thousands of young men went through weeks of brutal, methodical training. Each day began before dawn, with lectures on wind drift, bullet trajectory, and convergence points. Then came live-fire exercises, using towed target sleeves pulled by other aircraft, bright orange and riddled with holes from the previous day's misses. The instructors noticed something. Recruits who hesitated, who didn't trust their eyes, often hit more accurately. It wasn't that they were lucky, it was that their instinct to hold back accidentally compensated for the parallax error. By mid-1944, the rear aiming correction became standard doctrine. Manuals began to include diagrams showing deflection angles based on approach vectors. It was subtle, even counterintuitive, but in war, subtlety could save lives. Meanwhile, deep in occupied Europe, the Luftwaffe was feeling the change. Their pilots had once swooped confidently into the bomber streams, firing and rolling away before the defensive guns could track them. But now, more and more German planes were going down in flames. Crews reported that American gunners were faster, more precise, more deadly. In reality, the gunners weren't faster. They had learned when not to trust their eyes. One after another, testimonies poured in from returning air crews. In the debriefing rooms of English bases, still shaking from adrenaline, still reeking of gunpowder, gunners told stories of German fighters bursting into fire mid-dive. "I didn't even see him fall. I just saw the flash, then smoke. I thought I missed him. But the pilot said we'd scored a direct hit. That's when I realized aiming behind him worked." The statistics backed it up. In early 1943, bomber formations averaged 1 kill for every 400,000 rounds fired. By late 1944, that number dropped to roughly 190,000 rounds per kill, a staggering improvement. Not just from better weapons or more training, but from rethinking perception itself. It was a revolution in cognition under fire. Psychologists studying post-mission reports noticed how the human brain, under extreme stress, struggled with relative motion. A target moving across the field of vision appeared to lag behind its true position. That fraction of a second was enough to turn a near miss into a kill, or a death. By teaching gunners to consciously compensate for their instincts, they were in effect rewiring how humans fought. But progress always came at a price. Every improvement in American accuracy forced the Luftwaffe to adapt. The Germans shifted to head-on attacks, then to massed rocket volleys. They began deploying the new Me-262 jet fighters, machines so fast that no amount of aiming behind could compensate. The sky became an ever-evolving equation of life and death. By the winter of 1944, the air war over Europe had entered its most brutal and decisive stage. The Allied command called it Big Week, a relentless series of missions meant to destroy the German aircraft industry once and for all. For the men who flew, however, it was not a week at all, but a grinding eternity measured in missions, losses, and the names of friends carved into mess hall tables. The bomber crews of the U.S. 8th Air Force, once composed of wide-eyed farm boys and mechanics, were now hardened veterans of the sky. They had learned to navigate the deadly gauntlet of flak bursts and German interceptors. They had learned how to keep formation when engines failed, when friends vanished in fireballs, when the intercoms filled with screams. But perhaps the most important thing they learned, etched into their instincts through repetition and fear, was that everything they thought they knew about aiming had been wrong. Early in the war, many gunners believed that more bullets meant more kills. They fired in panic bursts, hoping to fill the sky with metal. It was understandable. Few things were more terrifying than a Messerschmitt diving straight toward you at nearly 400 miles per hour. But as records later revealed, those frantic bursts did little except waste ammunition. The U.S. Army Air Force's Statistical Analysis Division, operating quietly in the background of the war effort, studied gun camera footage, mission reports, and ballistic trajectories. Their findings were stark. In most air engagements, over 90% of fired rounds missed entirely. Even with the famous .50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns capable of firing 800 rounds per minute, accuracy in combat was extraordinarily low. The analysis revealed something else, something counterintuitive. When a gunner appeared to fire late or behind the attacking plane, his probability of hitting it actually increased dramatically. At first, commanders dismissed this as coincidence. But physicists at Wright Field in the Aberdeen Proving Grounds began to test this anomaly. They set up moving target experiments with high-speed cameras to track bullet paths relative to aircraft models. The data showed that because of parallax error, the displacement between the gunner's line of sight and the barrel of the gun, and the relative speed of both aircraft, the apparent alignment seen through the sight was deceptive. By the time the bullet reached where the target appeared to be, the target had already passed that point. In essence, to hit the enemy, the gunner had to shoot not where he saw, but where the target had been. Instructors began teaching this principle under the term negative deflection. Instead of leading the target, you corrected backward relative to its movement. It went against human instinct, but when trainees practiced with moving targets, the results were undeniable. Hit ratios improved. This revelation spread through the 8th Air Force's gunnery schools. At Kingman Army Airfield in Arizona, cadets were drilled relentlessly on visual lag correction. They practiced tracking model planes pulled by wires and learned to judge angles using nothing but intuition. One instructor, Sergeant Henry Wexler, explained it this way: "You're not aiming at a thing, you're aiming at a problem." By 1944, this training philosophy had become doctrine. The Army Air Forces even developed specialized teaching films to explain it. In one, a calm narrator explained over cartoon diagrams how the tracer lag caused the illusion of a forward target position. The film's message was simple: trust the math, not your eyes. Meanwhile, in England, these lessons were being applied daily in blood and smoke. The men of the 100th Bomb Group, nicknamed the Bloody 100th for their catastrophic early losses, embodied the transformation of American air warfare. In 1943, their survival rate was abysmal. Nearly 80% of crews never finished their tour of 25 missions. But by late 1944, something had changed. The Luftwaffe, once dominant, now found itself harried and outnumbered. American formations flew tighter, overlapping arcs of fire with mathematical precision. The new aiming doctrine meant that each turret became more lethal, especially against the classic head-on attacks that the Germans favored. When a formation of B-17s flew over Merseburg in November 1944, they were intercepted by over 50 FW-190s. In previous months, such an encounter would have spelled a massacre. But now, the German fighters were cut down before they could even reach the bombers. Gunners reported the strange sensation of seeing tracers miss the enemy, only for the plane to explode a heartbeat later. To the men in the turrets, it felt almost supernatural. "I thought I'd missed," wrote Staff Sergeant Elmer Haggerty in his diary. "I was cussing myself when his wing burst into flames. It looked like magic, but the instructor back in Kingman had told us,
aim behind the bastard, and he was right. These results weren't anecdotal. After-action data compiled by the U.S. Army Air Forces showed that by late 1944, the kill ratio of bomber defensive gunners had nearly doubled compared to early 1943. The improvement could not be attributed solely to better aircraft or formation tactics. It was a fundamental shift in how men thought under pressure. The broader implications of this change reached into military psychology. The research arm of the U.S. Army, then known as the Human Engineering Laboratory, conducted post-war analyses to understand how the brain interprets speed and motion. Their conclusion? Under stress, the human visual cortex lags by approximately 150 milliseconds when processing rapidly moving targets. That delay, imperceptible in daily life, could mean the difference between life and death at 400 miles per hour. By training men to consciously override this natural lag by aiming behind, they were effectively teaching them to compensate for human biology itself. The success of this adaptation inspired the development of mechanical aids. Engineers at the Sperry Corporation and General Electric worked feverishly to design gyro-stabilized gun sights that could automatically predict target movement. The K-14 gun sight, based on similar principles, entered service late in the war for fighter aircraft. For bombers, the concept became the foundation for future remote-controlled turrets like those in the B-29 Superfortress. Still, no machine could replace the nerve and judgment of a human gunner. In the logbooks of the 303rd and 381st Bomb Groups, you can trace the growing confidence of the crews. In early missions, the remarks columns are filled with notes like "missed due to high deflection" or "over-lead target." By the spring of 1945, those same logs read simply "target destroyed." And yet, for every lesson learned, there was a price paid. Many of the theories about parallax, deflection, and bullet lag came from the work of men who did not live long enough to see their findings published. Pilots, navigators, and gunners wrote letters and sketches, sending back crude diagrams from the field. One was found in the wreckage of a downed B-17 near Kassel, a hand-drawn chart scrawled on the back of a ration box. The author's name was never recorded. War, as always, was the greatest and cruelest teacher.
When Germany surrendered in May 1945, the war in the air did not end. It merely changed form. The lessons written in the blood of bomber crews were gathered, analyzed, and codified by engineers, tacticians, and psychologists. At Wright Field in Ohio, teams of analysts pored over thousands of pages of after-action reports, gun camera films, and ammunition expenditure logs. They measured success not in glory, but in probabilities. Their conclusion was unequivocal. The doctrine of rear correction had transformed defensive gunnery from desperation to science. This research directly influenced post-war air doctrine. As the U.S. Air Force was formally established in 1947, its early manuals on aerial combat reflected the same principle. Anticipate perception lag, trust predictive data, not reflex. The Korean War provided the first test of these ideas in the jet era. American pilots flying F-86 Sabres against Soviet-built MiG-15s discovered that even with radar gun sights, human perception remained a factor. Instructors who had once manned B-17 turrets found themselves teaching a new generation of jet pilots how to lead or lag targets based on velocity and closure rate. The aim behind mindset had evolved into a formal algorithm, a predictive logic that anticipated future motion instead of reacting to current position. Colonel Frederick Boots Bless, one of the leading aces of Korea, later wrote in his manual, "No Guts, No Glory." Air combat is geometry with fear in the middle. If you fire where he is, you're already too late. You must fire where he's going, or even where he's just been, depending on your angle. The origins of that insight traced straight back to the gunners of World War II. In the decades that followed, technological advances replaced the glass turrets and hand-cranked sights of the old bombers.
Automated fire control systems and computer-assisted targeting rendered human reflexes almost obsolete. But deep within those systems, the algorithms that calculated intercept vectors and bullet travel time was the same formula that once told a 19-year-old gunner to aim behind the target. Even today, modern aircraft like the F-35 use predictive algorithms that rely on the same fundamental physics: relative motion, lag, and parallax. The principles uncovered in 1944 have become universal truths of aerial warfare. But beyond science, the story of the 22 gunners carries a more human legacy. When historians interviewed surviving members of the 8th Air Force in the 1970s, many spoke not about tactics, but about trust. Trust in training, in their instructors, in the unseen mathematics that had kept them alive. They recalled how counterintuitive it felt to ignore their instincts, to not fire directly at the enemy, but how discipline had saved them. A few even credited that discipline with changing their post-war lives. "You learn patience," said former tail gunner Robert Healy. "The sky teaches you that what you see isn't always true. Sometimes you've got to wait, breathe, and aim behind what you think is right. It's a good lesson for everything." That quiet wisdom echoes far beyond military strategy. Archaeologists and historians studying downed World War II bombers in recent years have unearthed physical reminders of this transformation. Turret mounts recovered from crash sites still show chalk markings, small cryptic notes scratched by their last users. "Don't chase him," "lag sight," "hold and breathe." These small phrases, written by terrified young men in freezing winds at 25,000 feet, became the foundation of modern combat science. Even today, Air Force Academy cadets studying aerial gunnery history learn about the parallax problem, the ballistic lag, and the aim behind correction. It is taught not as trivia, but as one of the earliest examples of adapting human behavior through data-driven analysis. The men who discovered it didn't think of themselves as innovators, they were just trying to survive. But through their courage and their willingness to question instinct, they changed how nations fought wars in the air. When we look back at those grainy gun camera films today, we see flashes of light, tracers arcing through the sky, enemy planes breaking apart. What we cannot see are the equations behind them, the milliseconds of calculation, the decision to aim a fraction of a degree off, the invisible math that separated life from death. The legacy of those gunners is not just in the victories they achieved, but in the knowledge they left behind. They proved that even in the chaos of war, understanding, true mathematical understanding, can triumph over fear. And in doing so, they turned the sky itself into a laboratory of human resilience. The final line of one after-action report from the 390th Bomb Group says it best: "Our boys learned not to chase the enemy, but to think ahead of him. That's how they stayed alive. That's how they won." And that, quietly, invisibly, is how aiming behind the target helped win the greatest air war in history.